Can you imagine living in a country where your every step is watched, where the outside world is a mystery, and where the very idea of freedom seems like a distant fantasy? In North Korea, this is the daily reality for millions of people. What happens behind its closed borders is unbelievable, but even more shocking is how the regime controls every aspect of life, keeping the people in a cycle of fear and isolation. In this video, we will reveal the secrets that the government desperately tries to hide and show how this closed country has become one of the most enigmatic and dangerous places on the planet. Get ready to find out what they don't want you to know. Click like and subscribe to the channel. It will only take a second. North Korea arouses almost irresistible curiosity. A country shrouded in mystery, closed to the rest of the world, where the rules seem to be dictated by an oppressive silence. For many, trying to understand the reality of those who live under this regime is like exploring unknown territory, surrounded by distant myths and stories. It's a place where the unknown is part of everyday life, and the outside world can only imagine what really goes on behind its borders. Every detail about North Korea is shrouded in secrecy, from people's daily lives to the way the government exercises its power. The country is a unique mix of authoritarianism and mystery, where citizens live under constant surveillance but never question what is happening. The burning question is, what would it be like to live in a place where everything you know is controlled, censored, and manipulated by the regime? This fuels curiosity about countries like this, which remain untouchable for the majority. The psychological impact of living in such an isolated and restricted place is difficult to imagine. North Korea represents the extreme of global isolation, where contact with the outside world is virtually non-existent. Imagine growing up without the freedom to learn about other cultures, or without the possibility of questioning the information you receive. Silence and control are part of the essence of North Korean life, something the world looks at from the outside with bewilderment. There is a constant clash between global curiosity and the silence emanating from North Korea. What is kept secret? What is deleted? This tension between the unknown and the revealed fuels the thirst for answers and the desire to understand what is happening in one of the most closed countries on the planet. Behind this iron curtain, something happens, and the world continues trying to unravel what exactly is going on in the most enigmatic country of our time. North Korea has been governed by the same family for more than 7 decades, a regime that is perpetuated from father to son. It all started with Kim Il-sung, the great leader, who after World War II established the government that would transform the country into an isolated and militarized nation. Kim Il-sung established himself as an almost divine figure, revered not just as a head of state, but as a father of the nation. His government laid the foundations of the cult of personality that continues to this day, dominating the lives of all North Koreans. With the death of Kim Il-sung, power passed to his son, Kim Jong-il, consolidating a dynasty that only grew stronger over time. Kim Jong-il tightened control over the population, taking propaganda and indoctrination to new extremes. Under his government, the country faced devastating economic crises, worsened by even greater isolation. The regime hardened, and the idea of contestation became more unthinkable than ever. The people, however, continued to see the Kim family as a direct line to the glorious past that the government had promised. Kim Jong-un's rise to power brought with it a mixture of continuity and change. The young leader, although new compared to his predecessors, established himself as the 3rd generation of the Kim dynasty. His government, marked by tensions with the outside world, consolidated itself into a system of absolute control over the people. His image was carefully shaped to represent unwavering and aggressive leadership, and the cult of personality became even stronger, with his name being chanted in daily patriotic chants. The cycle of power seems unbreakable, and the Kim dynasty has become an intrinsic part of North Korean identity. Each generation builds on the previous one, forming a line of succession that reinforces total control over the lives of the people. The dynasty, for many, is immortal, and any attempt at change is seen as impossible. Thus, North Korea remains, decade after decade, trapped in the same regime, while the world curiously watches the unfolding of this almost mythological power. In North Korea, mind control begins at an early age. State propaganda is everywhere, permeating people's lives in such a profound way that the border between reality and fiction becomes almost imperceptible. From childhood, children are taught to revere the supreme leader as a savior, someone to whom they owe complete devotion. Every word, every gesture seems orchestrated to keep the population in a state of continuous adoration. The cult of the leader is so strong that any idea of dissent or questioning is inconceivable for the majority. Education in North Korea is one of the most effective tools of indoctrination. From the first day of school, children learn stories of the Kim leader's bravery and greatness, hearing narratives that extol their exploits and transform their image into something almost supernatural. The education system is not just a place of learning, but a propaganda machine, molding every young mind to blindly believe in the regime. Generations grow up without knowing any truth other than what they were taught, and this perpetuates a cycle of control that seems unbreakable. Beyond schools, propaganda spreads to all aspects of everyday life. Posters, songs, films, and even everyday conversations are flooded with messages that glorify the government and demonize the rest of the world. The people are constantly reminded that outside the country's borders, there are only enemies ready to destroy them. This creates a siege mentality, where loyalty to the regime is seen as the only salvation. The constant repetition of these messages creates a society where independent thought is nearly impossible. For those who dare to question the system, the consequences are severe. The regime not only physically punishes those who oppose it, but also mentally annihilates any idea of rebellion, making doubt itself a crime. The power of propaganda is so great that even defectors, after fleeing, report difficulties in abandoning the idealized image of the leaders they were forced to worship. This mind control is one of the North Korean government's most powerful weapons, and as long as it continues, the cycle of oppression will remain untouched. In North Korea, the feeling of always being watched is a reality that permeates everyone's lives. The government maintains absolute control over its citizens, and their every move is monitored with frightening precision. Cameras spread across streets, homes, and even workplaces capture everything, creating a climate of constant fear. The idea of privacy, as we know it in the Western world, does not exist. It's like living in a big cell, where the eyes of the state never stop watching. Surveillance is one of the main pillars that keeps the regime in power, stifling any desire for freedom. But surveillance is not limited to technology. Every citizen is potentially an informant, and the government actively encourages this practice. Family members, neighbors, co-workers, everyone is encouraged to report any suspicious behavior. The fear of being betrayed by someone close to you makes it impossible to fully trust those around you. The result is a society where silence is the best defense, and the expression of any critical thought can lead to devastating consequences. The control is so profound that people learn to watch themselves, even fearing their own thoughts. The feeling of being under constant surveillance creates devastating psychological pressure. People live in a permanent state of alert, where every word or action can be misinterpreted and lead to punishment. Cameras do not always need to be visible. The simple fact of knowing that they exist is enough to keep the population in a state of submission. The result is a population that conforms, accepts control, and follows the rules without question, as the risk of disobeying is too great. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia that affects all aspects of life. Surveillance is not only a tool of control, but also a way to emotionally isolate people. Anyone who lives under this constant observation disconnects from the freedom of being human. There is no room for rebellion, for questioning, not even for a sigh of relief. And so, fear feeds silence, silence feeds control, and the cycle continues, with life being monitored at every step. However, behind this veil of absolute control, there are always those who look for ways to escape this suffocating system. North Korea hides a cruel and shocking reality: its concentration camps. Although the government denies their existence, reports from survivors and defectors confirm that these camps are places of torture, starvation, and forced labor. Prison is not just physical, it is psychological, designed to destroy the human spirit. Those considered enemies of the state, along with their families, are sent to these dark places, where often the only escape is death. The punishment system is ruthless, and any suspicion of disloyalty to the regime can condemn entire generations to these invisible prisons. Inside these camps, the living conditions are unimaginable. People are forced to perform grueling work for hours on end, often without enough food to survive. Punishments are brutal and arbitrary. Reports of prisoners trying to escape and being tortured to death are common. There are no laws that protect prisoners, as they are considered less than human by the regime. For the government, these camps are not just places of punishment, but of re-education, where the ultimate goal is to erase any trace of opposition and shape total obedience to the supreme leader. Survivors who escape these horrors share stories that challenge our understanding of humanity. They describe a world of fear, hunger, and brutality, where hope is a forgotten word. These reports are a reminder of the atrocities that still occur in the 21st century, far from the eyes of the international community. The country's curiosity grows as the world tries to understand how such human rights abuses can happen with so much impunity. It is a reminder that in North Korea, justice is non-existent and human life is disposable. Concentration camps are a key part of North Korea's control mechanism. They act as a silent warning to those living outside their fences. Any act of disobedience will be punished with a life of suffering and humiliation. The fear of ending up in one of these camps makes people submit to the regime without question, and so the cycle of repression continues. However, there is always hope that these stories will come to light, exposing the truth that the government tries to hide at all costs. North Korea presents itself to the world as a self-sufficient nation, a concept that is promoted through the Juche Doctrine, devised by Kim Il-sung. However, this idea of economic independence is an illusion carefully maintained by the regime. The truth is that the country depends heavily on foreign aid, especially from China, to survive. International sanctions imposed over the decades have only worsened this dependence, forcing the government to resort to the black market and clandestine commerce to maintain minimal operations. The contrast between what the government discloses and the reality experienced by the people is abysmal. The population, in turn, suffers from a lack of basic products and an economy that cannot sustain its needs. Instead of true self-sufficiency, the people depend on severe rationing, with most resources being directed to the elite and the army. The rest of the population survives based on informal exchanges, clandestine markets, and even smuggling of products from China. Hunger is a constant presence, and the government does nothing but continue to propagate the illusion that the country is in full control of its economy. The black market has become an escape valve for many North Koreans. Through it, the population can access food, clothing, and even external information. These informal markets are tolerated by the government to a certain extent, as closing them completely could result in an even greater crisis. However, Surveillance remains intense, and any attempt to expand this illegal trade could result in severe punishment. For the people, these small transactions represent a fine line between survival and danger, but they are a necessity to resist the scarcity created by the regime. While the government continues to promote the idea that North Korea is economically independent, the truth is that the illusion of self-sufficiency no longer fools anyone. The world knows that the country survives only thanks to foreign aid and the resilience of its people, who find creative ways to circumvent the system in order to survive. However, this charade is steadfastly maintained, and curiosity about how this economic game works only increases as the North Korean government continues to propagate its controlled narrative. Hunger is one of the most devastating realities in North Korea. During the 1990s, the country faced a food crisis that resulted in millions of deaths. Since then, food shortages have become a constant part of people's lives. The government, through its propaganda, insists that the situation is under control, but the truth is that hunger continues to haunt a large part of the population. While the elite enjoy privileges and access to imported food, the rest of the country survives on minimal rations and what little they can get in underground markets. The inequality between the privileged few and the impoverished majority is brutal. In rural areas, hunger is even more severe. Farmers are forced to hand over most of their harvest to the government, leaving almost nothing for themselves. Malnutrition is endemic, especially among children, who suffer the physical and cognitive consequences of inadequate nutrition. Hunger in North Korea is not only an economic problem, but also a tool of control. The government uses food distribution as a way to reward those who show loyalty and punish those who demonstrate any form of disobedience. Hunger, in this context, is a silent punishment. International humanitarian aid, although essential, is carefully controlled by the regime. Much of the food sent by external organizations is diverted to the elite and the army, while the common people see very little of these resources. This creates a cycle of dependence and despair, where the population has no choice but to submit to the government's demands in the hope of guaranteeing the minimum necessary to survive. The contrast between what the propaganda shows and the reality experienced by the people is shocking. Food inequality exposes the fragility of the North Korean system. This reality generates a constant curiosity for the country. How can a regime that claims to be self-sufficient leave its population on the brink of starvation while guaranteeing luxury for a small elite? Hunger is a cruel reflection of the structural inequality that exists in North Korea. The government, instead of working to improve the living conditions of its people, uses this crisis as another tool of control and manipulation. And so, the cycle continues, as the world watches, trying to understand the complexities of this isolated nation. Songbun, North Korea's caste system, is an invisible structure that defines each citizen's destiny at birth. Divided into three main categories, loyal, wavering, and hostile, Songbun determines access to resources, education, jobs, and even food. Loyalty to the regime is rewarded with privileges, while any suspicion of disloyalty, even if it comes from past generations, condemns entire families to a life of deprivation and disadvantage. The system is ruthless and perpetuates a rigidly stratified society where social mobility is virtually non-existent. Those at the top of this hierarchy enjoy a relatively comfortable life in Pyongyang, with access to imported goods, cars, and even international travel. For this elite, North Korea offers a reality very different from that experienced by the majority of the population. Those classified as hostile, often because they are descendants of people who, at some point, were accused of treason or opposition to the regime, are condemned to a life of forced labor in rural areas or prison camps. Songbun turns the past into a life sentence, where an ancestor's crime can condemn future generations. The Songbun classification goes beyond defining social status. It also influences the level of surveillance and control to which each group is subjected. Citizens considered loyal have more freedom of movement, but are still under the watchful eyes of the regime. Those classified as hostile live in a state of constant paranoia, knowing that any false step could result in severe punishment. This caste system is one of the most effective forms of government control, keeping the population divided and weakened, unable to unite against the oppression they face. The idea that a person's destiny is predetermined by the Songbun system generates a country's curiosity, especially about how citizens manage to live, knowing that their future is practically sealed from birth. To the outside world, this system represents one of the many cruelties of the North Korean regime, a mechanism that stifles any hope for change. Meanwhile, the government continues to use Songbun to ensure that its position of power remains unshakable, with a controlled society at every possible level. North Korea is a country where freedom of information simply does not exist. Censorship is an invisible wall blocking any contact with the outside world. The government tightly controls everything citizens can read, watch, or listen to. There is no internet access as we know it, just an internal network that limits content to what the regime considers safe. Televisions and radios are pre-programmed to tune only to government-approved channels, while possession of any foreign material is severely punished. This absolute control of information makes North Korea one of the most isolated places on the planet. Censorship also prevents the population from accessing any form of international entertainment or information. Films, music, books, everything that does not glorify the regime is prohibited. However, the human desire to know what lies beyond borders cannot be completely suppressed. Small DVD players smuggled from China, flash drives with South Korean TV shows, and even illegal smartphones circulate in an information black market. These items are dangerous to possess, but for many, they represent a window into the world and a temporary escape from oppressive reality. The North Korean government uses censorship as a tool to maintain the illusion that the country is surrounded by enemies. By blocking access to any outside information, the regime creates a narrative in which North Korea is the only safe place, while the rest of the world is dangerous and decadent. This incessant propaganda shapes the perception of the people, who, without having access to other sources of information, end up believing what they are told. Censorship isn't just about what people can see. It's a way to control what they think. Curiosity about how this wall of censorship works is something that the outside world observes with fascination. How is it possible for a country to keep its people so isolated in a digital age? Even with all modern technologies, the North Korean regime manages to control the internal narrative with a precision that defies our understanding. The result is a society that lives on the margins of the truth, where access to reality is denied, and censorship shapes everything we know and believe. In North Korea, women live in a society marked by oppression, where their role is rigidly controlled by the regime. While state propaganda often presents women as pillars of the nation, the reality is much darker. They are expected to maintain an image of submission and obedience, both within the home and in society. Gender equality, which the government preaches so much, is a facade that hides a reality of abuse and inequality. Control over their lives begins early and extends to all spheres, from marriage to forced labor in factories or farms. Marriages are often arranged by the state, especially between members of the loyalist classes, to ensure continued ideological control. Furthermore, there are disturbing reports of trafficking in women who are sold to other countries, mainly China, in search of a better life or simply as merchandise. Prostitution, although illegal, is a growing problem, particularly in border areas. The regime turns a blind eye to these practices as long as they do not threaten the image the government wants to project. For women, escaping this cycle is almost impossible. Military life, which is mandatory for men and women, also reflects this inequality. Although many women serve in the military, they face extremely harsh conditions and are often victims of abuse. Despite this, state propaganda glorifies the role of women as heroes of the revolution, painting a picture that is far from the truth. Hard work and hardship are romanticized, while voices that try to expose injustices are silenced. To the outside world, curiosity about the role of women in North Korea reveals the profound disconnect between what the regime presents and what actually happens. Even in the face of so much adversity, North Korean women demonstrate incredible resilience. They fight for survival, whether working in extreme conditions or trying to find a way to escape the regime's shackles. They play fundamental roles in the underground economy and the black market, where they can support their families. The spirit of resistance that they carry, even in such an oppressive system, is proof of the unshakable strength that exists within each of them. And it is this strength that in some way keeps the hope of better days alive. In North Korea, education is not just a means of learning, but a powerful tool of indoctrination. From their earliest days at school, children are taught to idolize supreme leaders and view the regime as sacred. Classes are filled with stories that glorify the Kim dynasty, while the rest of the world is portrayed as dangerous and decadent. The objective is not to form critical and well-informed citizens, but to shape minds that blindly follow the government's ideology. Education is carefully planned to ensure that independent thinking is eliminated before it even arises. Preparation for war is a central part of the school curriculum. From an early age, children learn about the importance of defending the nation against its enemies, with a special focus on the United States and South Korea. This militarized mentality is ingrained in such a way that young people grow up believing they are in constant danger, surrounded by enemies. This not only fuels fear, but also strengthens loyalty to the regime, which presents itself as the sole protector of the North Korean people. The school environment, therefore, is not just a place of learning, but an extension of state propaganda. The absence of any form of critical thinking in North Korean schools is intentional. The government fears that real education, which promotes questioning and analysis, could destabilize its control over the people. Thus, disciplines are shaped to ensure that young minds do not see beyond what the regime allows. The arts and sciences are taught in limited ways, and any content that might suggest alternative ways of thinking is quickly censored. For most North Koreans, education is a mental prison, where knowledge only serves to reinforce indoctrination. Even with these limitations, there is an elite that has access to a broader education, often in privileged institutions in Pyongyang. These young people, usually children of the upper class, are trained for leadership positions in the government or army. However, even they do not completely escape indoctrination, as everything still revolves around loyalty to the regime. The country's curiosity about North Korea's educational system is fascinating. How can a nation use education, something that in many places is seen as a key to freedom, as a tool of mental imprisonment? This is one of the darkest paradoxes of this regime. North Korea's cities offer a misleading view of the country, especially for the few foreigners who manage to visit. Pyongyang, the capital, is a true showcase for the regime, with wide streets, imposing buildings, and grandiose monuments that glorify the Kim dynasty. However, this image of prosperity and modernity is carefully choreographed to hide the reality that most North Koreans face. The city is inhabited only by the elite loyal to the government, while the rest of the country lives in conditions of extreme poverty. The contrast between the capital and rural areas is profound and devastating. Outside of Pyongyang, the scenario changes drastically. There are ghost villages, built with the sole purpose of deceiving the outside world. These places were created to appear lived in and prosperous, but in reality, they are empty. These cities are often used in propaganda, portraying a North Korea that simply does not exist. This is a common tactic of the regime, which strives to maintain appearances even if it means constructing fictitious scenarios. For the few who manage to escape the country, the real North Korea is a land of abandonment, where many houses and farms lie empty and in ruins. Life outside Pyongyang is marked by unimaginable hardship. Electricity is scarce, access to drinking water is limited, and public transport is practically non-existent. In contrast, the capital boasts modern trams and subways, but they are used more for show purposes than to meet the needs of the population. Rural areas, which produce most of the food, are neglected by the government, which focuses its efforts on maintaining Pyongyang's image. This disparity fuels curiosity about how the regime manages to maintain this facade while the reality is so different. Reports from deserters reveal the true face of these ghost towns. They speak of villages where the lights are only turned on when there are foreign visitors, and of entire cities that seem frozen in time. This manipulation of the urban image is yet another tool of the regime to deceive the outside world. Yet behind these illusions, the real North Korea is collapsing, and the gap between Pyongyang's elite and the rest of the population continues to grow, leaving a country divided by a carefully constructed facade. In North Korea, the police and army are not just security forces. They are the pillars that support Kim Jong-un's regime. The power of these institutions goes beyond protecting the territory. They are responsible for keeping the population under tight control, using force and fear to ensure there is no resistance. The army, which is one of the largest in the world in terms of personnel, is a tool of mass indoctrination, where loyalty to the supreme leader is hammered home daily. The secret police, meanwhile, operate in the shadows, ensuring that any whispers of dissent are quickly silenced. Life in the North Korean army is marked by extreme conditions. The soldiers, many of them forcibly recruited, live a reality of deprivation and blind obedience. They are trained to see the outside world as a constant threat and to protect the regime at any cost. Military propaganda permeates every aspect of the lives of these young people, who often enter military service with no other option. Although the regime extols the role of the military as defenders of the homeland, the reality is that many soldiers are little more than disposable tools in the hands of a government that prioritizes their own survival. The North Korean secret police, known as Bowibu, are feared by everyone. They operate in a ruthless surveillance system where every citizen is a potential traitor. Informants are everywhere, and any misstep, no matter how small, can result in arrest, torture, or even execution. Bowibu not only controls the common population, but also monitors the elite itself, ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, challenges the regime. This total control creates an atmosphere of fear, where trust between people is almost non-existent. The army and police in North Korea are not just security institutions, but essential mechanisms for maintaining the regime. They ensure that power remains firmly in the hands of the Kim dynasty and that any threat to the status quo is crushed before it even arises. This reality creates a curiosity about how a country can function under such control, where each citizen is forced to live in a constant state of alert. And, while the army and police guarantee the stability of the government, the people continue to live under a cloud of fear without seeing a clear way out. In North Korea, technology is not an instrument of progress, but a tool of control. The government, aware of the power of information, deliberately keeps the country in a state of technological backwardness. The internet, as the rest of the world knows it, does not exist. Instead, There is an internal network called Kwangmyong, which limits citizens' access to information strictly controlled by the regime. Smartphones, although available to a small portion of the population, are monitored and do not have access to the global internet. Everything people can access is carefully filtered to ensure the government narrative remains intact. The technology that reaches the hands of ordinary citizens is purposely obsolete. Computers, when available, are controlled by the state and used primarily for propaganda purposes. Most people don't even have access to them. The most modern electronic devices are reserved for the elite, who enjoy a level of technological comfort that contrasts sharply with the rest of the population. However, even this elite knows that any device can be monitored at any time. Technological backwardness is a way of ensuring that people remain disconnected from the outside world and the ideas that could inspire resistance. However, North Korea also uses technology in surprising ways. While the population is kept in the dark, the regime invests heavily in cyber attacks and cyber espionage. Secretly trained North Korean hackers are responsible for global attacks that aim to steal information, funds, and destabilize other nations. These hackers are one of the most feared forces in the world of cybersecurity, operating from a country that barely allows its citizens to access the internet. This disparity between internal backwardness and external advancement in technology is one of the most intriguing facets of North Korea. The decision to keep the country technologically backward is a deliberate strategy to preserve control over the population. The government knows that access to modern technology could trigger an awakening among the people, and that is something the regime cannot risk. For the outside world, this generates constant curiosity about how North Korea manages to balance this internal backwardness with the need to compete globally in areas such as cybersecurity. The result is a country trapped in technological limbo where progress is carefully calculated and always at the service of the regime. In North Korea, the state positions itself as the only force worthy of worship. Religion, in any form that challenges the cult of the Kim dynasty, is considered a mortal threat. The regime not only banned religious practice, but created fake churches to deceive the few international observers who managed to visit the country. Within these churches, freedom of worship is only pretended, while true religious communities are forced to operate underground. Christians and other religious minorities live in hiding, practicing their faith in secret and at constant risk of being discovered. Religious persecution in North Korea is brutal. Those caught practicing any form of faith are sent to concentration camps, where they face forced labor, torture, and often death. Religious practice is seen as a betrayal of the state, as loyalty must be dedicated exclusively to the supreme leader. The paranoia surrounding religion is so great that even family members of believers can be punished, being dragged to the same cruel fate. For many, faith has become a form of silent resistance, something that challenges absolute government control. Despite repression, there are reports of small groups continuing to practice their beliefs in secret. Clandestine meetings, held in unlikely places such as basements and forests, are an act of courage. For these believers, faith is a light in the midst of darkness, a hope for freedom that the regime tries to extinguish at all costs. However, these meetings are incredibly dangerous, and simply possessing a Bible can be a death sentence. Persecution is a weapon used by the regime to ensure that worship is limited only to the figure of Kim Jong-un and his predecessors. Curiosity about how religion manages to survive in such a hostile place raises many questions. How do these small religious communities continue to exist despite all the control and repression? What motivates these believers to risk everything for their faith? These questions are part of the world's fascination with North Korea, a country where even spirituality is treated as a threat to the state. But behind this repression, there is a resistance that refuses to disappear. fueled by the hope that one day, freedom of faith will be possible. Escaping North Korea is one of the riskiest acts a citizen can attempt. The heavily guarded border is a death zone, where any attempt to escape is punishable by summary execution or life imprisonment in concentration camps. Defectors who manage to cross the border face a new challenge: fleeing through China, where they can be captured and deported back, often to an even worse fate. The decision to flee for many is a choice between risking their lives or continuing to live in unbearable conditions of oppression. Escape routes are extremely dangerous. Many choose to cross the Yalu River, which separates North Korea from China, despite heavy patrols on the banks. Others try to cross the border into Russia, but few are successful. Once outside, defectors face the challenge of crossing into China without being detected by authorities, who often cooperate with the North Korean regime. Stories of successful defectors are rare, but they serve as a reminder of the high cost of trying to escape one of the world's most oppressive regimes. For those who manage to reach South Korea or other countries, life outside North Korea is a mix of relief and trauma. Many defectors suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, bearing the psychological scars of years of oppression and terrible living conditions under the regime. Adapting to the outside world with its freedom and advanced technology is a profound shock. However, the security of being out of reach of the North Korean government provides a relief that few can describe. But even outside, the fear of retaliation against their families left behind never goes away. The escape from North Korea is a story of extreme courage and a desperate fight for freedom. The curiosity about how these defectors manage to escape and survive in a completely different world is one of the most intriguing facets of the North Korean reality. They are living proof that, despite all the barriers imposed by the regime, the human desire to be free cannot be completely erased. And as the world watches, many still try, risking everything to escape the clutches of a regime that keeps them prisoners in their own land. North Korea has built its international reputation around fear and unpredictability. The development of its nuclear program transformed the country into a feared, even if isolated, power. Nuclear weapons are used as a diplomatic bargaining tool, allowing the North Korean regime to maintain its position on the global stage. Kim Jong-un's regime knows that its weapons are the guarantee of its survival. Without them, the government would lose its main intimidation mechanism and could be vulnerable to external intervention. Thus, with each nuclear test, global tension increases, and North Korea gains more influence. North Korean diplomacy is based on constant threats of war. The regime uses aggressive rhetoric to ensure the world remains on alert. With each new provocation, especially against the United States and South Korea, the North Korean government ensures that international attention never wanes. For the internal population, this policy is justified as a necessity to protect the country from its enemies. State propaganda ensures that the people believe that nuclear weapons are their only defense against an imminent invasion. Despite economic isolation, North Korea manages to maintain its military capacity through clandestine channels. The illegal arms trade and cooperation with other authoritarian regimes allow the country to continue developing its weapons technology. The regime is aware that its nuclear threats are valuable currency at international negotiating tables. This dangerous game of fear diplomacy puts North Korea in a position of power, even though it is a small and economically devastated country. International sanctions have little effect on the country's nuclear policy, which continues to defy global expectations. Curiosity about how such an isolated country managed to become a nuclear threat is one of the questions that intrigues the world. North Korea has built an arsenal that keeps global powers on constant alert. With each new show of force, the regime reaffirms its position and makes it clear that, as long as it has nuclear weapons, it will be in control of its destiny. This diplomacy of fear is key to the regime's survival, and the world watches, aware that any false move could trigger devastating consequences. Although North Korea presents itself to the world as a self-reliant and independent nation, its relations with China tell a different story. China has been, for decades, the North Korean regime's largest and most important ally. This silent alliance is crucial to the survival of Kim Jong-un's government. China provides much of the resources North Korea needs, including food, fuel, and economic support. Despite international sanctions, trade between the two countries continues, allowing the North Korean regime to keep its fragile economy afloat. The relationship between China and North Korea is complex. While China sees the Kim regime as a useful tool for maintaining stability in the region and countering the influence of the United States and South Korea, there are also tensions. China has been pressuring North Korea to abandon its nuclear tests, fearing that an escalation of tensions could destabilize the region. However, the North Korean regime continues to defy these pressures, trusting that China will never completely cut off support. For Beijing, a stable, if unpredictable, North Korea is preferable to the chaos that a regime fall could cause. Clandestine trade between the two countries is a fundamental part of the North Korean economy. Many of the sanctions imposed on the country are circumvented through secret commercial agreements with Chinese companies. This flow of goods and resources, although unofficial, sustains the regime and allows it to keep its population under control. North Korea's dependence on China is evident, but this dependence is mutually beneficial. China maintains influence over the neighboring country, using it as a geopolitical barrier against the West. The curiosity about how these relationships work on such a delicate level is intriguing. North Korea, despite its narrative of self-sufficiency, is heavily dependent on its largest neighbor. As the regime continues to defy global expectations, China watches carefully, ensuring its strategic position is not compromised. This silent alliance between the two countries is one of the most important pieces on the region's political chessboard. And while North Korea remains isolated, its connection to China ensures that isolation is never total. North Korea has built its identity around the idea that it is in constant danger of invasion. State propaganda portrays the outside world, especially the United States and South Korea, as enemies ready to destroy the nation. This narrative of imminent war has been hammered into the minds of North Koreans since childhood. At every opportunity, the regime reaffirms that, without the leadership of the Kim dynasty, the country would be destroyed by its enemies. Military propaganda is so intense that many citizens sincerely believe they are always on the brink of conflict. This feeling of siege is fed daily by speeches, TV programs, and even education in schools. The regime presents itself as the only protector against external threats, and the need to maintain a strong army is justified based on this supposed constant threat. This narrative not only keeps the North Korean people on alert, but also serves to strengthen loyalty to the regime. War propaganda is an effective tool to ensure that the people continue to see the supreme leader as the only one capable of saving the nation. In addition to shaping internal perception, military propaganda is also used to send messages to the outside world. Grandiose military parades, featuring missiles and weaponry, are designed to demonstrate strength and intimidation. The regime knows that the image of a militarized, combat-ready North Korea keeps global powers wary. It is a strategy that mixes psychological warfare with spectacle, creating an aura of unpredictability around the country. With each new show of force, the regime reinforces its image of invulnerability. The curiosity about how war propaganda shapes the mentality of an entire country is immense. North Korea has managed to create a nation where fear and loyalty go hand in hand, fueled by a narrative of constant threat. To the outside world, this propaganda may seem exaggerated, but within North Korean borders, it is an inescapable reality. The people live with the belief that their survival depends on a regime that protects them from an invisible and ever-present enemy. In North Korea, culture is not a reflection of the people's creativity, but a tool of control in the hands of the government. Film, music, and the arts are rigorously monitored and shaped to promote the regime's ideology. Films that exalt the Kim dynasty and glorify sacrifice for the nation are produced on a large scale, while any art form that questions the government's authority is unthinkable. Artists are limited by censorship and live under constant pressure to create works that serve the interests of the state, not their own inspirations. Cinema, in particular, plays a crucial role in North Korean propaganda. Large-scale productions, which often have direct government oversight, portray stories of heroism and sacrifice on behalf of the country. These films are shown repeatedly, reinforcing the regime's narrative that North Korea is a strong nation surrounded by enemies. Film production is seen not as an artistic expression, but as an extension of the propaganda machine designed to manipulate the emotions and thoughts of the population. Music and visual arts follow the same path. Patriotic songs praising the supreme leader are played throughout the country, and artists who stand out for their loyalty to the regime are rewarded with privileged positions. Theater and painting, when permitted, are also used as vehicles to propagate the government's ideology. Creative freedom, so valued in other parts of the world, is non-existent in North Korea. The regime understands that culture has the power to influence minds, and therefore closely controls every aspect of it. Curiosity about how culture is manipulated in North Korea raises questions in the outside world. How can a nation stifle the creativity of its people and still use art as a tool of control? For many, what is happening in North Korea is a reminder of the power that art has, both to liberate and to oppress, depending on how it is used. The North Korean government has chosen the path of oppression, turning culture into a weapon against its own people. Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, is more than just a political figure. He was shaped, from birth, to be seen as an almost mythological figure. The regime invests heavily in creating its image, portraying it as an infallible leader, a military strategist, and a protector of the people. State propaganda presents Kim Jong-un as someone with superhuman abilities, continuing the legacy of his predecessors, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. His every move, his every word, is exalted by the controlled media, creating a cult of personality that permeates every aspect of North Korean life. Kim Jong-un's eccentricities, such as his lavish lifestyle and taste for Western luxury goods, contrast sharply with the reality of most North Koreans who struggle to survive in a country ravaged by poverty. However, these aspects of his life are hidden or justified by the regime, which strives to maintain the image of an austere leader focused on the nation's well-being. Stories of his glamorous lifestyle, such as his love of expensive cheese and luxury cars, rarely reach the general public, who see him as a symbol of sacrifice and leadership. The control that Kim Jong-un exercises over the country's army and political elite is absolute. He consolidated his power through a series of violent purges, removing any possible threat to his rule. Even members of his own family were eliminated to ensure his reign remained unquestioned. This iron control, combined with incessant propaganda, has created an atmosphere in which Kim Jong-un is seen as untouchable. Any criticism, no matter how small, is treated harshly, further reinforcing the fear and blind loyalty that sustain his regime. Curiosity about Kim Jong-un, both as a man and as a leader, is constant. How did he manage to consolidate so much power in such a short time? What is the real face behind the propaganda? The outside world watches with fascination and apprehension, trying to understand the mind behind one of the most opaque and dangerous regimes on the planet. Meanwhile, within North Korea's borders, the myth of Kim Jong-un continues to grow, fueled by a propaganda machine that shows no signs of slowing down. North Korea's future remains shrouded in uncertainty. To many outside observers, the regime appears unbreakable, with its combination of oppression, propaganda, and isolation keeping the population in submission. However, behind this facade of absolute control, there are signs of change. The population's growing exposure to external information through media smuggling and the presence of the black market slowly begins to erode the regime's narrative. The question that remains is whether these small gaps will be enough to trigger real transformation in the country. The possibility of an internal revolution, although unlikely, cannot be completely ruled out. The suffering of the people, worsened by hunger and inequality, continues to grow. However, the fear installed by the regime is still a powerful barrier against any attempt at rebellion. Younger generations, who are more exposed to the outside world, could become the key to change in the future. If openness continues, even if limited, it is possible that the desire for freedom will begin to override fear. But this will depend on many factors, including support from the international community. Reunification with South Korea is another scenario discussed, but it is fraught with complications. The gap between the two Koreas is immense, both in economic and cultural terms. Reunification would be a long and painful process, and many in South Korea are wary of that future. Still, for some, the hope of a united Korea is a light at the end of the tunnel. The idea of a future without the Kim dynasty, where the two nations can coexist peacefully, remains a distant but possible dream. Curiosity about the future of North Korea is immense. Will Kim Jong-un's regime be able to stay in power for more decades, or will the desire for freedom finally find a way to manifest itself? The world watches, waiting for signs of change, knowing that any change to the status quo could have global repercussions. North Korea's future is ultimately a mystery, just like its present, and only time will tell if this closed-off country will finally open up to the world.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop, we're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.